Okay, get this. What if you could literally drain the Mediterranean Sea? Just get rid of it. And in its place, unite Europe and Africa to create a brand new supercontinent. Now, I know it sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, right? But this was a real plan. It was called Atlantropa, and it might just be one of the most audacious and frankly bonkers engineering projects anyone has ever seriously proposed.
So just take a look at this map right here. Like I said, this isn't fantasy. This was a real proposal, cooked up back in the 1920s by a German architect, a guy named Herman Sörgel. And his big idea, his grand vision, was to physically stitch Europe and Africa together by, you guessed it, shrinking the Mediterranean down to a fraction of its size.
And that really was the whole question at the heart of it all. What if you could just drain the Med? For Sörgel, it wasn't a matter of if it could be done. Oh no. For him, the only question was what incredible things would happen when it was done. I mean, talk about confidence. This was a vision that came from a place of absolute faith that technology could fix anything, no matter how huge the problem seemed.
All right, so how on earth did he actually plan to pull this off? I mean, draining an entire sea. Where do you even start?
Well, the core idea was, in a way, shockingly simple, even while being monumentally complex. Step 1. Build a truly enormous hydroelectric dam right across the Strait of Gibraltar. This would basically plug the hole connecting the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. And then you just wait. You let the sun do its thing. Natural evaporation would slowly but surely lower the sea level, revealing huge new stretches of land. Simple, right?
But that begs the real question, right? Why? Why would anyone come up with something so unbelievably drastic? Well, to get that, you have to understand the world Sörgel was living in. We're talking about the Europe of the 1920s, a continent that was completely broken and drowning in crisis.
Just think about it. World War I had just ended, leaving total devastation in its wake. Europe was, for all intents and purposes, on its knees. You had crippling economic depression, political chaos everywhere, massive resource shortages, and this constant nagging fear that another, even worse war was just around the corner.
And right into the middle of all this desperation, here comes Herman Sörgel with his grand plan. He basically pitched Atlantropa as the ultimate cure-all. A single, massive technological solution that would fix everything. We're talking limitless clean energy, huge new territories for people to live, jobs for millions. He even claimed it was a surefire way to guarantee world peace. What a sales pitch. But you have to understand, this vision was about so much more than just building dams and getting electricity. At its core, this was all about geopolitics. This was a plan to literally redraw the world map and create an entirely new global power structure.
See, Sörgel's argument went like this. For Europe to have any chance of surviving and competing with the massive industrial power of America and a rising Asia, it couldn't just stay, well, Europe. It needs to get bigger. It needed to physically connect with Africa and become a new, totally self-sufficient supercontinent. He called it Atlantropa.
And what's fascinating is how they sold this idea to the public. The promotional posters presented it as this incredibly high-stakes black and white choice. On one side, you have Untergang, which means the downfall, the end of the West. And on the other, Lebensraum, new living space. The message couldn't be clearer. Either you do this, you merge with Africa and forge a new future, or you're doomed to fail.
Okay, but here's where this utopian dream for Europe gets a very, very dark underbelly. Because this whole grand vision was built on a foundation for Africa that was deeply colonial and, let's be honest, pretty sinister.
You don't even have to read between the lines. This one quote from Sörgel himself says it all. He saw Africa as a filled, untouched savings bank. Think about that. Africa wasn't meant to be a partner in this new world order, not at all. It was just a resource to be cracked open and exploited for Europe's benefit.
And his specific plans for Africa were, well, they were just as huge but so much darker. He was talking about damming the Congo River to create a gigantic inland sea, creating a second sea to water the Sahara. And of course, this would involve forcibly moving huge numbers of African people to the south, all while stripping the continent of its natural resources. He basically saw Africa as this blank slate for European engineers to draw on, with absolutely zero consideration for the people, the cultures, or the ecosystems that were already there. Even his idea for world peace was really about control. The plan was to create this massive, unified power grid connecting everyone.
It would be managed by some independent group, and if any country started to look like it wanted to start a war, well, they could just flip a switch and cut off their power. Peace through coercion, basically. So here's the bottom line, and it's a really important one. This dream of a peaceful, technologically advanced, united Europe was completely tied to its imperialist, racist, and exploitative plans for Africa. You couldn't have one without the other. They were two sides of the same coin.
And as if the whole ideology wasn't deeply troubling enough, the project itself was basically a recipe for an environmental and geological disaster of epic, global proportions.
So the project would have created over 500,000 square kilometers of new land. To put that in perspective, that's an area bigger than France. But here's the catch. It wouldn't be some green paradise ready for farming. Nope. For generations, it would have been nothing but a vast, unusable, barren salt flat.
I mean, the sheer hubris of it all is just staggering when you look at the cascade of consequences they were courting. You'd have historic ports like Venice and Genoa suddenly stranded miles from the coast. The change in water weight could have triggered earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. It would have drastically messed with regional and global climates. The entire marine ecosystem of the Mediterranean, gone. And all of these catastrophic risks, they were pretty much just swept under the rug by Sörgel and his followers.
So, you might be wondering, with all this planning and all this promotion, why isn't this our reality? Why aren't we all living in the supercontinent of Atlantropa right now? What happened?
Well, in the end, it just never got off the ground. It failed to get any real political support. Even the Nazis weren't interested. They had their own brutal plans for Lebensraum in Eastern Europe. And then, after World War II, the world changed. You had the rise of nuclear power, new alliances like NATO, and the whole idea just became obsolete. When Sörgel died in 1952, the dream of Atlantropa pretty much died with him, fading into a strange little footnote in history.
But its story is so much more than just a weird historical curiosity. It's really a powerful cautionary tale. It's a warning about the dangers of what some people call techno-solutionism. That super tempting but really dangerous idea that you can solve any complex human problem, social, political, economic, you name it, if you just throw a big enough engineering project at it.
And that really is the big question Atlantropa leaves us wrestling with today. As we come up with our own grand plans to re-engineer our world, whether it's with AI or geoengineering, this story forces us to stop and ask some really hard questions. Who really stands to benefit from these massive solutions? And maybe even more importantly, who is being left out of the blueprint and who will ultimately be asked to pay the price?